For the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the divisions that exist between us. 3 weeks into a tumultuous administration, and after the election and the year leading up to the election, there's been so much, I guess division is the word, acrimony, and it's just been very difficult for us. And as always, when we talk about these issues, we don't talk about the issues themselves. We don't talk about the positions and the platforms and the parties. That's not our place here. Here we want to talk about our personal response. How do we formulate a personal response? How do we deal with and navigate through the difficulties that we see in front of us? Because if we can look above and beyond those dividing points, we're going to see a commonality on the other side. We're going to see a connection on the other side. That's what we're trying to foster here. How do we deal with that? But the division marches on, doesn't it? In the media, you've got all the extreme talking heads. They're doing their thing. And social media, I'm seeing some really vitriolic posts back and forth on both sides. And so that's still going. Between families and friends. There are family members who are disowning other family members for having opposite points of view. And friends are being separated, and churches are obviously not exempt from any of this as well. I just read yesterday where the lead pastor of one of the mega churches here locally in South County had to issue a big old apology, kind of a serial apology, because he posted on the platform formerly known as Twitter. Anyway, and it looked kind of benign to me, but it had to do with the inauguration and whatnot. And by lunch, he had 400 comments on the thing, and it was just blowing up, and he had to turn off the comments and then make these apologies. It's a minefield. It's very difficult out there. Everybody's at a fever pitch, and there's all of this vitriol going on. I've heard so many times in counseling and talking to people, I just can't understand how a person can come up with that position. I can't understand how a good Christian, how a good pastor, how a good person could possibly hold, that platform, that position. And it's gotten to the point where we don't see the other side as wrong, but we actually see the other side as evil. And that's what I want to try to address here, but in a roundabout way. Again, this is going to be about our response to the issues. How do we navigate through? Because both sides are absolutely sincere. When you talk to them, they're really sincere. They want what's best, and they're absolutely certain that they're right about what that best is. And they're distressed, and some of them are grieving about the way things are going. But the truth of the matter is that both sides can't be right? And both sides are not the enemy either. So both sides are not the enemy. What is the enemy? Who is the enemy? And I actually gave you this quote last week, but I want to bring it up again. It's in your inserts if you want to take a look at it. I'm looking at it right now, and I remember the first time that I quoted myself on an insert like this, my daughter came up and said, "You're quoting yourself? What's wrong with you?" I said, well, sometimes you just got to do it. So the real enemy is not the other tribe. It's the certainty that makes the other tribe an enemy. And if that doesn't make any sense, when you think about it, when we are absolutely certain of something, we're right, that makes everybody else wrong. And if we are emotionally attached enough to our certainty and our rightness, then that turns into an enemy. It's not just a difference of opinion. We're really at odds with each other. But the enemy isn't the other person. The enemy is the certainty that makes an enemy of the other person. Certainty makes enemies of everyone who disagrees. But when you really come down to it, how certain can we really be about pretty much anything? Let alone existential issues. We'll get into that in a second. But even political issues, how certain can you be? Do you really think that you always have enough data to be absolutely certain of your position? And even if you do at any given moment, don't circumstances change on the ground? Don't data points change? Are you open enough and flowing enough and absorbing enough, present enough to be able to flow with the changes? This is the things that we don't think about when we think about our certainty. Even the theory of relativity, as well established as that has been for over 100 years, is still just a theory, right? Whereas the laws of mechanics, Newtonian mechanics from a century before, even those only work within certain parameters. And when you exceed velocities in the laws of mechanics, suddenly they don't respond anymore. They don't describe what's going on anymore. Hence the theory of relativity. That takes over when you get close to the speed of light. But it's still just a theory, which means it doesn't have enough data yet. We haven't tested it enough in all situations to know whether it actually gets the name of a law. And then we'll probably find out even that law only works within certain parameters, and then we're going to have to come up with something else. So how certain can we ever really be? There's so much space for us to be liminal. And we've talked about liminality before. Liminal is the Latin word for threshold. So it means to be in the threshold of the door, to be between the camps, to be able to see the comings and goings, to be able to see if there's truth on the other side where you don't expect it to be able to criticize your own camp when it's necessary. But that's the place from which, on the edge of inside, that we can actually be able to have a space that makes sense, that can bring in all of the flow of data and flow of circumstances and still see another person, not as the enemy, but another human being. It gives us a space for humility. Humility is just the ability to see ourselves as we really are, in our relationships with each other, in our relationship with God, or the existential, all of that. So to be able to connect with that, we have to have this space that stays on the edge of inside, in that liminal place. And the question, of course, is how do we get to liminality? How do we move off the place of certainty and move into a place that is expansive and always in motion? It's got to be through a constant questioning. Asking yourself, what do you really know for certain? Now, moving back to the existential, I remember 30 years ago, that was the question I was asking myself all the time as I was trying to reabsorb Christianity, but now not in a Catholic setting, but in an evangelical setting. And constantly, what is it that I know for sure? What is it that I absolutely can say is never going to change? And I went through all the essentials of Christianity, you know those, right? The virgin birth and the vicarious atonement and bodily resurrection. I mean, you name it, all the essentials, Trinity, all the essentials of faith. Do I really know those for certain? And I had to admit, no, I really don't. Not for certain. There's voices on all sides of every argument. Which one do I listen to? How do I know for sure? Even talking about the miracles of Jesus, do we need to take them literally? Are they absolutely supposed to be literal miracles? Are they metaphoric? Are they spiritual? How do we know for sure? Voices on every side. How about heaven and hell? What can we know about that? What do we know about death? What do we know about the afterlife? Well, we have all these images. We have all this doctrine. We have tradition. But do we know that for sure? How do we know that for certain? How about the problem of evil that we talked about 2 weeks ago? If God is all good and all-knowing and yet evil exists, how? How is this possible? How can we know for certain what God's real nature and plan is here when we look at the world and look at what seems to be just such chaos often? At a certain point in my journey, and we talked about this before, you just have to admit, that I didn't know everything, that I couldn't know everything for certain. And all those voices that kept talking to me and yammering in all these different directions, so confusing, even panicking, because I wanted to get this right. I had to just turn them off. I had to stop listening. I had to put my stake in the ground at the point of the Father's love, as I say over and over and over here. And this so reminds me of that scene from the movie Jackie, and I know I brought this up for you before, and I think I even played the clip one time. But it's just so perfect. And this is Jackie Kennedy right after the assassination, and she's counseling with a Catholic priest. And they have a series of sit-downs together throughout the movie. But the last one that they have is the one that really is intriguing to me, because she has told him that she just wants to die. She doesn't feel like she has any point being alive anymore. She's no good for her children. She just wants to die. And he says to her, and this is the great John Hurt, and it was only a few months before his death. And I don't know who wrote this, if the screenwriter actually wrote it. I'd like to imagine that John ad-libbed a lot of this stuff, trying to channel through what he was feeling, knowing that his death from cancer was imminent, but decided to keep working. But he says, there comes a time in man's search for meaning when you come to the realization that there are no answers. And when you come to that unavoidable, horrible realization, well, you either accept it or you kill yourself, or you simply stop searching. What does he mean by simply stop searching? I think it's that we realize, and this is my experience, that those answers that I was seeking that seemed so crucial, so absolutely obsessively essential to me at the beginning of my journey, as I lived longer, as I absorbed more, they began to fade in importance. I began to see them as non-essential. I was leading with my head at the beginning of my journey. But as I continued to live and immersed more in life and the connections of life and experienced the suffering of life, then I started to move into a different place and to realize that I already knew everything that I needed to know. The truth really is not out there bouncing around someplace. It was right here. But that took some time. And I stopped listening to the voices, and I stopped searching so hard for rational answers because life was starting to show me something else. My prayer life was starting to show me something else. My connection with other people who were trying to take this journey alongside was showing me something else. The priest says to Jackie after this, he says, I've lived a blessed life. But every night when I climb into bed and turn out the light, I wonder, is this all there is? She says, you wonder? He says, every soul on the planet does. But in the morning, you wake up and make up the coffee. Why bother? He says, because you did this morning, and you will tomorrow. And God, in his infinite wisdom, makes sure that it's just enough for us. That's the key, isn't it? There are things that we can't know. There are things that we will never know. We're not supposed to know. If we knew some of the things that we are searching for, life would cease to exist for us with any kind of meaning. It is the mystery that pulls us along. It is the mystery that keeps us going. We want things that would destroy our experience of life and destroy our ability to perform the purpose that we're here for. But God, in his infinite wisdom, makes sure that what we do know is just enough for us. It's just enough. There's not so much that comes to us that we can store it. We can't put it into a bank account and put it there, right? It's kind of like the manna that the Israelites had rained down from heaven every morning. But if they tried to store it and keep it, it was all moldy and horrible by the next day. You couldn't store it. You had to continue to be dependent on God to rain down that sustenance every night. Because if we could store it, it would be certainty. And certainty is an impossibility in this life. That's something we've got to get through our heads. As human beings, we cannot be certain. Not about the existential things. We might be able to be certain about the mechanics of engineering a bridge, but not about the things that touch our souls, not about the things that are buried in relationship and buried after the curtain of death. We don't know these things. We get just enough to get us to the next moment. It's like breathing. You can't store up breath, right? It's a constant respiration, in and out. We breathe in just enough for the moment, and then we exhale, and we breathe in again. This knowing of God is just like respiration. We breathe it in, we get just enough for the moment, and we breathe it out. And then we have to breathe in again. We can't store it up. We can't become static, or we're no longer in the faith walk. We can't become static, or we're dead, really. Jesus says, why do you look for the living among the dead? They're not going to be there. It's part of this respiration. I was just talking to someone a couple of days ago, and she was telling me that although she's been a salaried employee with Chalk Hospital and another company after that for years and basically her whole adult life, when she got let go from her last job, she was kind of spun around, didn't know what she was going to do. Well, she ended up, because she had so much experience with these other companies, someone called her and said, I heard you got laid off. We really need some help at this company. And that led to another company and another company. She's hung out a shingle. She's got a consulting business. She's her own boss, and she's working from home, and she absolutely loves it, but it's absolutely terrifying at the same time because you don't have this big corporation around you anymore. You don't have a paycheck that's coming to you that you can count on, and you know exactly what's coming out for FICA and exactly what's coming out for state and local. All of a sudden, you got 3 jobs. You got to get the work, you got to do the work, and you got to collect for the work. She's a freelancer now. Yeah, business owner nodding his head. It's a whole different trip between being a salaried employee and being a freelancer, having your own business. It's an absolutely profound change. And it's one that has spiritual implications that we got to think about. You know, when the Jews when they were liberated from Egypt and they went to Canaan, there was a profound change that we really don't think about too much. But take a look at Deuteronomy 11 and just see how this change was part of their spiritual reality and their spiritual awareness. For the land into which you are entering to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you came, where you used to sow your seed and water it with your foot like a vegetable garden. But the land into which you are about to cross to possess it, a land of hills and valleys, drinks water from the rain of heaven, a land for which the Lord your God cares. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it from the beginning even to the end of the year. Do you see what's going on here? Y'all know about Egypt and the great Nile River and the Nile River Valley, how it floods annually and deposits all the silt and all the nutrients to the agricultural areas around it. And all you had to do was create channels and irrigate and direct the water where you wanted it to go. But where they were going in Canaan, there was no such water system. There was no water that was on the ground that could sustain agriculture. And so they were completely dependent on the rains. Geshem in Hebrew is the rains. They had the early rains and the latter rains, the Yoreh and the Melchosh. But they couldn't control the rains. They came straight from God. They were uncontrollable, right? Irrigation, or water drawn by hand, was a symbol of self-reliance apart from God in the mind of the ancient Hebrews. It was something that you could control. It's something that you could treat with certainty. I like to think of the effect. 17 years now of 1 year at a time, right? We just never really know if we've got another year past the one that we raised funds for. It's the difference here. You know, I think we're all meant to be freelancers because the freelance reality keeps our feet to the ground. It keeps us aware of the rhythms of life and the way that things rise and fall. When we get a salary position, we get lulled into the illusion that everything is constant and will always be constant. That paycheck will always be there. My job will always be there. I mean, we're finding out that's not the case anymore, right? But the illusion is there. I think we get our senses dulled a bit. There is not the elation when you get a client and you know you're going to get a paycheck and you can pay the rent that month. You know, doesn't have the fear of not getting that client. But there's something about those rhythms. There's something about being completely dependent on a power greater than ourselves that changes the nature of our experience of life. So whether we're salaried or not, this doesn't mean salaried employees need to quit your jobs and go freelance. No, it's a matter of even within that situation, that circumstance, you become more aware of the rhythms. You become more aware of the dependence that is still there, even though it seems more and more reliant. If we can remember that we're still dependent on the rain that comes straight from God, then everything is going to begin to change. But of course, the good news is that it's always raining with God. There's never a moment where the rain is not falling. It's just up to us to see it. It's up to us to become aware of it and realize, yeah, we can't store it. it'll always be just enough for that moment. Now, what is the it that we're talking about? What is this rain? What is the it that we're talking about? I mean, yeah, we're talking about the answers that we're obsessively going after because we fear not having certainty. The knowing is what we're talking about. But this knowing and these answers are not going to be rational. They're not going to be theological, and they're not going to be abstract. What is this it that we're talking about that's just enough for us? And, I suppose the best I can say is that it's life itself. It's just life. The whole sweaty bundle of life. Life as it presents in all of its warts and everything that's going on. It's the wildly unpredictable and completely uncontrollable parts of life. Experiencing that, rolling with that. And I suppose you have to live long enough to be able to see enough to get a sense of the bigness of life, how really beyond our control it is. Early on, we can imagine that we've got control of this thing. We can build this platform, we can build a bank account, we can build a business that's going to insulate us from the uncontrollable parts. But you live long enough and you realize that doesn't happen. I suppose you got to live through the joys of enough marriages. Maybe not serially, but And maybe you got to live through the heartbreak of divorce. Maybe you got to live through babies being born and grandbabies being born, right? But also the miscarriages and maybe the stillbirths and the heartbreaks of life. How about the huge successes and the accomplishments and the highs that we get from that? The breathtaking views that we see when we travel or do the things that whatever it is that we do. But then there's the illnesses and the accidents that limit what we can do anymore. Maybe it's just old age as we start to watch our world grow smaller, watch the window start to close down on the things that we can do. Maybe it's sitting with a friend who has cancer, or maybe is facing an amputation, and really looking into their eyes and being close to what is going on in their life right now and what they're facing, what they're thinking, trying to understand. Knowing that there's nothing you can do, but at least just being present. Maybe it's the suicide that you never saw coming. But also maybe it's the healing and the reconciliation that you never saw coming. It's all of that. It's everything that is experienceable for us as a human being. This is what we're talking about. And when we really have experienced this, when we've opened ourselves up, when we haven't hidden away, when we haven't pulled away, self-medicated, or done some of the things that we do because it just gets to be too much sometime, if we really will lean in and experience life, then I tell you what, those questions that we were asking at the outset over theology or doctrine or politics, they sure become small. They become toothless. And they really become irrelevant to this direction of life that we're living. We may, of course, rage at the machine when things really get bad, and we're going to question those who still are holding on to their certainty when it's fled from us because of the trauma du jour, all right? But all the time, if we are honest with ourselves, we're becoming more and more convinced that life really has no answer in the way that we were looking for it, except just the living of it. That's the answer to life. And in those big life moments that we have, both the joyful ones and the suffering ones, or whether it's in our silent prayer time, maybe our meditation, our worship time, what we're really doing there is we're accessing momentary non-dual states. Yeah, that's a lot of syllables. But non-dual means that we experience life as one thing. Normally, life is very dualistic. We see everything in pairs of opposites. It's light and dark, it's good and evil, it's male and female, and they're mutually exclusive, and they're diametrically opposed, and they're in conflict with each other. And that's the way that we see life. It's us and them. Friend, foe, right? But when we access these momentary non-dual states, we're seeing life as one thing. All of that falls away. In the midst of great love or great suffering, everything falls away, and there's only one thing. It's that pair of eyes that's in front of you that you're talking to. It's the baby that you're holding. It's the sunset that you're watching. It's just the absolute absence of ego that you access in your prayer time, if it's silent. All of that are these non-dual states that we experience everything as one thing. No separation, no division. We don't see any of that in those moments. If you think about your peak moments that you've had, when the moment was intense enough to blow all that rest of that away, there was no separation. There was no division. It was all one thing. And when we have a moment like that, we want it to last forever, don't we? But then we come back to our senses, of course. We start thinking rationally again, and we come back to our minds. And as soon as we're thinking in words, as soon as we're thinking in images and thoughts, then everything jumps to its corner, and we're thinking dualistically again. We can't store those non-dual moments. It was just enough for us in that moment, like the breath. But the good news is it's always raining, right? We can access those moments anytime we want and every moment we want, again and again. All we have to do is become so present, so immersed. Step aside from that mechanism in our minds that wants to drop everything back into dualism. We can do that over and over. We can string those moments together like a pearl necklace, and suddenly we find ourselves in a different character. We find ourselves living in the character of kingdom, because this is what Jesus means by kingdom. It is the experience of life non-dually. It's the experience of life as one thing. Everything is one thing. And of course, that's what he calls love. That's why love is so central to Jesus' gospel and his message. Absolutely. Love is the oneness, the identity with the other, the connection we find when we stop searching for answers that keep our mind in a dualistic mode. When we just stop, allow ourselves to fall in, everything begins to change. When we stop trying to be certain and we just let the moment be enough for us, and we string enough of those moments together, we realize something has changed in us. The author Mirabai Starr puts it this way. She says, in these non-dual states, we befriend reality. We become intimate with all things by offering our complete attention. And that's really what it comes down to. Can we offer our complete attention? Can we not be non-dualistic in our mind, trying to multitask and just be one place at one time? And then, of course, we're going to start thinking again, right, about the questions, imagining the differences and the distances between us. What is really so simple, we want to make complex again. We want to add all the layers and all the bits. And why do we do that? Why do we keep making it complex? Because simple is uncontrollable. Simple is uncertain, and therefore simple is frightening, even terrifying. Jesus continues to bring us back to the simple. All these laws that the Pharisees recognized, everything that the people were supposed to obey. And Jesus says, you know what? It comes down to this. Love God with your whole heart, your soul, and your strength. Oh, and there's one more. It's like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. All of the law and the prophets, everything that is contained in our belief system comes down to that. Love God. Love your neighbor. And then he makes it even simpler than that at the Last Supper, doesn't he? I have a new commandment for you. Forget about that old one. That's too complex. Just love each other the way I've loved you. That's it. And they're going to know that you're my tribe by the way that you love one another. That's it. Just love one another. So simple. Love. Be completely intimate, at one with. everyone and everything that shares your moment with you. And it will be just enough for you. But then, of course, what are we going to do? We're going to start asking questions again. Well, I'm supposed to love my neighbor, but who's my neighbor? And, of course, he answers with the Good Samaritan story, right? And blows their mind because the good neighbor is the Samaritan that they hated so much, that they saw as enemy. Well, how do I love God completely then, with my whole heart and soul and strength? How in the world do I do that? Well, that's a good question. How do we love God? We're supposed to love God in the same way that we love others, and we're supposed to love others in the same way we love ourselves. Well, there's a string there, but it may not really get us to the bullseye, get us to where we want to go. How do we love God and love others? And the two are related. They have to be. They exist together always. They're inextricable. They're indivisible in each other. And I want you to think about this, that we really don't love God directly. We don't love God directly. We don't love God in isolation. Maybe that's a better way to put it. That's impossible to do. Well, you're probably thinking, well, what about my prayer? What about my meditation? What about my worship? What about the ritual that I go through? What about all those things? Isn't that loving God? So I'd like to submit to you, if you look at it historically, some of the people who have been most devout in their ritual practice, in their prayer practice, in their church, did some of the most heinous things in human history. We know that, don't we? We see that over and over again. We quoted Blaise Pascal, people never do evil so cheerfully, I love that, cheerfully and completely, as they do from a religious conviction. Somehow we know that just doing the ritual that we do, that we say we're loving God through, doesn't do anything for us if it doesn't also connect us to the ground, if it doesn't connect us in relationship and connect us to each other. All the prayer and all the religious practice, spiritual practice that you do or can do, the best it does is to help you to access those momentary non-dual states. That's what it's there for. But there's no meaning in any of that until or unless we carry that non-duality out into the world again, out into the streets of our lives, where it will change the nature of our relationships and change the nature of our experience of every moment that we have. Because now we're carrying our non-duality out into a world that we can actually see as one thing and not everything, all the diversity, all the choice of enemies that we have. We can start to see the world as one thing, as completely connected. And then we realize that we can love God by loving each other. And that's the only way that we do it. It's the only way that we can do it. The only way to love God is by loving each other. And if you think I'm making this stuff up, take a look at 1 John 4. This is the verse right after our signature verse, 1 John 4:19, right? We love because God first loved us. But listen to what 4 John 20 says. If someone says, I love God, and yet he hates his brother or sister, he is a liar. For the one who does not love his brother and sister whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And then James, 2nd chapter, puts a finer point on it. What use is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone says he has faith but has no works? Doesn't bring the faith back out into the world where it can actually affect the nature and experience of our relationships. Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warm and be filled, yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? In the same way, faith also, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. Trying to love God in isolation, directly by itself, is dead, is what he's saying. The ritual doesn't mean something unless it allows us to access that non-duality that we take out and then practice in the love that we now have for each other because we see them as extensions of ourselves. We see them as one with us, even if we intellectually disagree. And this is so basic. The only way to love is to identify with the beloved, identify with the other. We have to see ourselves as one with them, see ourselves as fellow creatures. And if we haven't cultivated these non-dual moments, if we haven't allowed them to be enough for us in those moments, then we're still all going to be about the questions. We're going to be all about the differences. And we're going to never be able to understand them, the other, or their beliefs, or their positions, their hopes, their fears, their dreams, all of that. The person who probably said this best is Mother Teresa. You know, little 4'0" Mother Teresa, who kind of turned the world upside down for 3 generations or so. She called this loving God or loving Jesus in his most distressing disguise. This way of loving God, loving Jesus, not just in isolation, but by loving each other, she called it loving Jesus in his most distressing disguise. And I want to read just a little bit from a blog post to see if we can put a finer point on this. From the time of her birth in 1910, Agnes Boiagiu, and you probably never heard her full name, Agnes Boiagiu, Mother Teresa, was trained to respect the dignity of others, even those society ignores. Each weeknight, Agnes's mother invited poor people into their home for dinner and conversation. She especially welcomed women in distress, old widows with no caretakers, homeless women with no roof, and unwed mothers shunned by family and friends. Agnes's brother later commented that our mother never allowed any of the many poor people who came to our door to leave empty-handed. When we would look at her strangely, she would say, "Keep in mind that even those who are not our blood relatives, even if they are poor, are still our brethren." It was through serving these visitors that Agnes first discovered Jesus in his most distressing disguise. She came to value the poor not because of what they could do or produce, not because of their job or credentials, but because they radiated the image of God. According to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the dignity of the human person is rooted in his creation in the image and likeness of God. Thus, from the beginning until now, every man and woman bears the divine image and so bears within an inestimable dignity. People often ask Mother Teresa why she loved the poor so much, how she could honor dignity in such difficult situations. In response, she liked to grasp their hand and slowly wiggle one finger at a time and explain, "You did it to me. You did it to me." What's she talking about? Well, she's talking about Matthew 25. Take a look. Starting at verse 34. This is a vision of that great, what would you call it, resurrection and meeting in heaven, where we come face to face with the King, with God. And the King will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." And then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?" And the King will answer and say to them, "Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me." God, Jesus, is disguised as one of us, disguised as all of us. There is no distinction. There is no disconnection, not at the deepest level. But we won't see that until we move into those non-dual states. This is so fundamentally important, and yet so universally overlooked at the same time. How often do we land on this and keep talking about, well, Agnes sure did, Mother Teresa. But once you see it, it's hard to unsee. It's hard to look away. It changes you in this way. I want you to hear it from Mother Teresa. And I found a video where she's talking at one point directly to the camera, and I've never seen that before. And it was just really arresting. Some of the images from her work in Calcutta and voiceover, she's talking about what she believes along these lines, about Jesus in his most distressing disguise, and then talks to the camera about acceptance and about how we connect with God through the work that we do and just the moments that we let be enough for us. So as soon as Alex is ready, he's going to roll that for us.
Jesus said that I have chosen you. I have called you by your name. You are mine. Humanly speaking, what the sisters are doing, it is out of the question. But once you realize whom you are touching, whom you are loving, that makes the difference. Jesus very clearly said, I was hungry, you gave me to eat. I was naked, you clothed me. I was homeless, you took me in. I was lonely, you consoled me. It is Jesus, the distressing disguise of the poor. To be where he wants you to be. If he puts you in the street, if everything is taken from you and suddenly you find yourself in the street, to accept to be in the street at that moment. Not for you to put yourself in the street, but to accept to be put there. This is quite different. To accept if God wants you to be in a palace, or then to accept to be in the palace as long as you are not choosing to be in the palace. This is the difference. This is what makes the difference in total surrender. To accept whatever he gives and to give whatever he takes with a big smile. This is the surrender to God. And to accept to be cut to pieces and yet every piece to belong only to him. This is the surrender. To accept all the people that come, the work that you happen to do, to have today maybe you have a good meal and tomorrow maybe you have nothing. There is no water in the pump, all right? To accept. And to give whatever it takes. It takes your good name, it takes your health, it takes, yes. That's the surrender. And that is you are free then. I picked up a man from the street and he was eaten up alive with worms and nobody could stand near him. He was smelling so badly. I went to him to clean him and he said, why do you do this? And I said, because I love you.
Why? When we see the other as God in disguise, when we see the other as ourself, there's no end to what we can accomplish. There's no end to what we can do. But to break through the divisions, to break through the seeming, impossibility of connection, that's it. To imagine that kind of work doesn't mean that we need to do that kind of work. She said the work that you happen to do, whatever it is you already get up and do every day, that's it. That's all you need to do. But to do it with that sense of oneness at the heart, at the core of each moment and each conversation changes the nature of the way that we relate. To be able to accept each moment as enough for us as it is, and not be constantly thinking that we have to import or take something away in order for it to be acceptable. It changes everything. I want to read again what she said, just to capture it again. She said, to be where he, God, wants you to be. If God puts you in the street, if everything is taken from you, and suddenly you find yourself in the street, to accept to be in the street at that moment. Not for you to put yourself in the street, but to accept to be put there. This is quite different. To accept if God wants you to be in a palace, well then, to accept to be in the palace, as long as you are not choosing to be in the palace. This is the difference. This is what makes the difference in total surrender. To accept whatever God gives and to give whatever it takes with a big smile. That's surrender. That's a non-dual moment. This is what we're talking about. God disguised as the moment, and everyone and everything in it. There's no control. There's no certainty in a moment like that. It's only surrender. And there's no division. There's no separation either in a moment like that. And that is the definition of love. In these non-dual moments, that's when we hear God. And that's the only time that we hear God. But he's not answering our rational questions. He's not talking in any kind of complex theology. God's voice is a wordless loop that we either enter or we don't. And every time we enter, we're hearing the same message over and over again. I am here. Everything I have is yours. All will be well. All is well. I am here. Everything I have is yours. All is well. Over and over. That's what we know. That's as certain as it gets. Yes, we want more. Of course we want more. But I am here. Everything I have is yours. All is well. If we let it, is just enough for us. Let's pray. Father, you are just enough for us. Forgive the fact that we want so much more in our minds. You've actually already forgiven us. You know what it's like to be human. We want to be able to lean into you. We want to be able to let go and let moments be enough, but it is so difficult. And sometimes we're just not up to the task. So help us in those moments not to give up, not to imagine that the principle doesn't hold anymore, but to come back to the next moment, to realize that it is always raining, to realize that your voice, non-verbally, is always speaking those words that we truly need to hear. Help us to realize that when we stop searching for what we want is when we'll find what we need in you in each moment. Thank you, Father, for that empowerment. Thank you for that presence. Never let us forget we can only love because you loved us first. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's all stand.